Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today's topic is nightmares and stress dreams. We've covered dreams a lot on this podcast. There's at least 3 episodes you could go back and listen to. We're taking a different spin on dreams this time, talking about the sort of darker, more painful, difficult aspect of dreams. Sometimes that means stress dreams, very common for most people to have stress dreams, but where do they come from? Why do we have them? What's the utility of having a stress dream? Why can't dreams just be happy all the time and fun and magical fantasies? Even more on the sort of painful spectrum or dangerous spectrum is nightmares. What's the difference between stress dreams and nightmares? Why do we have nightmares? The kind of thing that wakes you up in a cold sweat. What is that? What's the point? What's the psyche trying to achieve by doing it? What's the process that we are undergoing when we have a nightmare? So Alyssa, start us off with some opening thoughts.
I think dreams are a good representation in many ways of like the full spectrum of the psychic experience, right? Like, as you said, why can't it all be nice and fantastical and fun? And probably for a lot of people, actually, the vast majority of their dreams are pretty either neutral to kind of fun or sort of nonsensical seeming.
I actually wonder what, if you were to take like a survey of, the general population, whatever that means, would people say that their dreams are generally positive, like fun, feel good, beautiful?
Yeah.
Because I would imagine most people's dreams are just kind of neutral.
Yeah.
Or sort of like they can be kind of interesting
Or like kind of just like weird. Like,
or it can be like, that's like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Exactly, sort of confusing. But how often do people actually really have, beautiful dreams? That's like a different topic, I guess, is the opposite direction of like, wow, what a great dream. Why does that happen?
I want to go back to sleep.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in some ways, people probably, I don't know what the average would be, I'm not going to guess, but more so what comes up for me is that there are probably times in your life where you experience acute stress dreams and nightmares for a period of time where the intensity or the frequency has increased. And that certainly calls into question what's going on in the internal system, what's happening externally. Stress dreams and nightmares to me are indications of more difficult, hard to deal with, unprocessed inner psychic material, outer stressful events, you might say, that are affecting you in this deeply embodied way and in a deeply psychological way as well. And so you might be in a period of time that's more acutely stressful. Maybe something's coming up for you that's like really deeply buried, painful, wounded stuff. Hence nightmares might be coming up. But yeah, I think it's ultimately the indication, as dreams really are, of the inner workings of the psyche.
So let's go over some common stereotypical stress dreams. So everyone has stress dreams.
Yeah.
If you haven't had a stress dream, you're a weirdo.
You're lucky.
Maybe you're like a prince or something and you've never had a stressful experience in your life, but it's pretty unlikely that you haven't experienced a stress dream, and stress dreams regularly. I think most people will experience them regularly. So common stress dreams, for instance, like naked in public, that's like a stereotype.
Yeah, especially like all of a sudden I'm naked.
Yeah. Losing something that's important to you. You can't find something that you really need. You're late for things, like, oh, I'm late for work, or I'm late for class. Or,
Yeah.
And these dreams are usually not frightening. It's not really the right way to put it. Like,
they're not terrifying.
Like waking up, not waking up, but like, I have a test to take today and I didn't study. Is that scary, or is it more just kind of stressful, right? What's the difference really? But these are common stress dreams. So if we get into personal examples of stress dreams, for instance, there's ones that everyone probably regularly has. A return to some sort of scene or environment that was once stressful in your life. It's pretty common.
Yeah.
So for me personally, for instance, I have a lot of stress dreams about school. I think this is very common for most people who have certainly, gone to school through high school, gone to college, definitely just this kind of long, ongoing experience of participating in some kind of system where you have to pay attention and learn and do homework and then be tested on those things. And the stakes are pretty high. And if you don't do well, something bad's going to happen to you. Like you're going to fail or be held back, or you won't get into school, you won't get into college, you won't get a good job. So it's clear that school is kind of universally stressful for people, which is kind of sad to think about, honestly, like how much trauma comes from just like this pressure of having to go to school as a child. But that's really common for me, is the school environment. Another common environment that's stressful for me is the restaurant environment. I know that's true for you too, Alyssa. But some that are kind of like more humorous, I think, but still very stressful. One that I have all the time is that I cannot find a toilet. And I have to pee really bad, and usually I think this is linked to a physical sensation of actually having to pee.
Okay. Yeah.
Pretty much always, I think. And so, for instance, like there was one dream I had one time that I thought was like particularly humorous, where I was kind of like in a labyrinth, like in some strange maze that was kind of like dreamlike or out of like an Escher drawing or something like that. And I'm like running around trying to find a toilet somewhere and like opening doors, and like there's no toilet. And I'm just like, oh God, I gotta pee so bad. And there's no thought of like, oh, I'll just go pee in the corner right there. And that's like a really common dream that I have, is like I cannot find a toilet. And that's interesting because it's like sort of like probably like a physiological response.
Right. I kind of want to expand on this for a moment, because as much as we can kind of tap into like the symbolic and emotional aspects of stress that are coming into the dreamscape, there's this dynamic connection to like what's happening on a physiological level with the body and how that emerges imagistically during dreams. For me, one time I was like walking, and then all of a sudden I get like attacked by this animal. This is a dream. And it's biting my hand, and I can feel all this pressure on my wrist. And then I woke up and I was actually sleeping on my wrist weird. Like I didn't really actually hurt it, but I could feel all this tension, and it was kind of stuck in this really uncomfortable position.
Yeah.
So with your toilet dream, when you wake up, you notice that you like really have to go to the bathroom.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or I wake up and I already did. Just kidding. That's only happened once. Anyways, other examples for me personally are like I'm on stage and I'm ready to perform with my bandmates.
Yeah.
I played in bands for a long time when I was younger. And either the rest of the band doesn't know the song, or it's like, okay, it's time to perform in front of this huge crowd. And it's like, oh, wait, like we have no idea what we're doing. And like the crowd is just like, boo, stuff like that. And again, the restaurant. So I used to work as a bartender, and I have dreams where I'm in the bar and I'm either swamped with customers who are like ordering drinks, and like I either can't get to all of them, or I'm fumbling around with all the bar equipment trying to make drinks and it's all spilling everywhere. Or we're just out of everything. Like, oh, we've run out of lime juice. We've run out of whiskey. Like all these cocktails are being ordered. Like I can't make any of them. Stuff like that. So it's playing upon real experiences, often with stress dreams, real environments from the past, a way that you've been conditioned perhaps to anticipate a certain kind of situation that might be upcoming. Like maybe you'll have to take a test soon, Arran, or maybe you'll have to play a song on stage soon, or maybe you'll have to, handle these customers at the bar. Like there's something being projected outward that's from the past, and maybe we can kind of go over some of your examples.
Yeah. Well, I think just to inject like a moment of reflection for those listening is how revealing it is about what continuously comes up for stress dreams. As you mentioned with your examples here, often what I find both with myself and other people is that there's quite a commonality with the stress dreams, that there's always a particular image or a symbol or an environment that's being brought back again, back again, back again. And so what does that say for you that like the band was this time of stress? And not even that the dream is like always like going back to that actual era of your life, but what was it at that time that brought up stress now? What can you tie back to it that reflects on what your relationship is to things that are disturbing you or upsetting you? And sometimes it's hard with certain dreams that repeat a lot because it's not very obvious. Like for me, also having been in bands for many, many years, for some reason that doesn't sit in my psyche as stressful. I have never had a band stress dream.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say playing in bands was like never ever stressful, but I just never have them. But I do have the restaurant dreams. I worked at a restaurant out of high school all throughout college. It's a great gig to have when you're a young person. But my God, what an intense pressure cooker of an environment to be in. So that to this day, I am still, when my life feels out of order, when things feel chaotic, stress dream, I'm in the restaurant. I cannot get to tables in time. There's too many orders. I can't run the food. There's nobody there to help me. Customers are fighting. The managers are fighting. There's something about that intensity. And when I think back to my time in the restaurant, as positive as it was sometimes, it was also like extremely overwhelming. So it's become this incredibly potent psychic symbol for me. Another pretty often dream motif that I have is teeth falling out. And I think this one actually like walks the line between being quite nightmarish and sort of typical stress dream. I wouldn't really call them nightmares, but they're horrific. And I think part of what seems to really define nightmares is that like deep embodied sense of like terror or fear. There's really powerful affect that's happening during nightmares, and I've woken up from some of these teeth dreams with just a real sense of major disorientation and like needing to touch my mouth and make sure my teeth are still there. They're really scary. But an interesting pattern that I've noticed with my teeth dreams, and I looked back in my dream journal, I've been noticing this now for a year that I look back, is that I'm looking for a dentist. So it's not just that my teeth are falling out. There is a sense of like, I need to call the dentist. I'm trying to get to the dentist's office. Or in my most recent dream, which is like a week ago, my teeth were falling out and I was like pulling them out of my mouth. It was really gross and scary. But then I had this sense, you know what? I can call the dentist and it's going to be okay. And I felt really calm. So there's interesting dynamics playing upon the stress dream and what's typical for you, what happens, and especially the emotions that are present are going to be really telling of how to work with it and how to interpret it.
Yeah. So what's the reason this is happening? That's kind of, the question of, there's the question of like, what are dreams in the first place and why do they happen?
Yeah.
What purpose do they serve, or what's the process that's happening inside of you that leads to a dream? And again, we have a dreams episode you can go look up where we talk about this. But in short, the way that I find useful to think about dreams is that they are essentially projections that are happening in a vacuum. So we also have a projection episode. You can listen to that. But this may sound kind of strange and extreme, but reality as we know it is experiential. The thing that we are experiencing right now as quote unquote reality is one gigantic projection. It's a collection of projections. Everything, all the objects we see, all the people that we're interacting with, everything that's happening to us, we are in some sense projecting internal contents onto the world in order to make sense of it. And so dreams are that projective faculty is happening in a vacuum, meaning there's no external information, no external data on which to ground your projections. So instead, they're just happening sort of in space. So because of that, a lot of what you're dreaming is essentially material that's inside of you or in the unconscious, however you want to think of it. It's material that is being projected outwardly and forming objects, forming scenes, forming certain situations, forming certain kind of emotional reactions to things, but they're happening in a vacuum. So if you're having a dream that's a stress dream, for instance, there is some part of your body that is entertaining what could happen, maybe, or how to deal with something in your life that's stressful. So even if you have a stress dream about being in a restaurant and having too many customers, that might just be one way in which your body is projecting a stress response to your current situation, which might be that like maybe you have children and that's really stressing you out because you are not sleeping enough and you're trying to keep track of them. And so it's important to really think about the stress dreams, any dreams for that matter, as being sort of not necessarily literal, not necessarily commenting very specifically on the specific things that are in the dream. For instance, if you dream about a certain person, it's important to not to say, well, the dream is clearly a commentary on that person. It's like, well, be careful with that. It might just be that that person in the dream is kind of a projection of some symbolic representation of someone you can't trust, let's say, or it's, some of your sexual libido is being projected into some woman in the dream, and it's not necessarily that the person in the dream is someone that you should go explore sex with. It might just be that like they're just a sort of container for sexual libido. And so you have to really get into like, what is your own personal projective mythology essentially, or what is your own personal ontology? I know it's like a big word, but everyone has like their own sort of set of unconscious contents that need to be projected into certain containers.
Right.
And that's what we're doing when we're awake. It seems strange, but like that's what we're doing when we're awake, is we're projecting things onto the items and objects around us to make sense of them. But in the dream, we're doing the same thing. Anyways, that was sort of a long-winded sort of explanation, but give me some of your commentary.
I think the important thing to pull out of that is the dynamics of the projective container and how dream images are really offering us an insight into these inner dynamics, unconscious aspects via symbolic images. And if we first and foremost take an approach that our dreams are reflecting aspects of ourself, which in classical Jungian terms is called the like subjective interpretation, everything is a representation of me, that when you dream about, your boss, and it's a stressful dream, maybe it's not necessarily reflective that there's a dynamic happening out in the world right now where you and your boss aren't getting along, but rather maybe that there is a challenging inner aspect represented by authority that you are in a contentious relationship with and that needs to be viewed. But that stress that you feel, the emotionality and the dream and the interactions you have with that projective figure lead you to deeper insight by when you go through the interpretive process, you get to examine what exactly is happening in the dream. Are you fighting the boss? Is the boss yelling at you? Do you feel like you need to stand up for yourself? Do you feel fear in the dream? Do you feel a sense of oppression in the dream? All of that speaks to these inner dynamics where something needs to be addressed. And often I think when we start getting into that stressful territory, we're in an area of challenge. We're in an area of growth. Maybe we're in an actual stressful environment, but aspects are then kind of boiling up to the surface that maybe might be helpful. Maybe you're so dissociated from your own sense of personal authority that an authority figure in the dream just feels really threatening. Maybe it's like an invitation to an integration of that, right? So dealing with stress dreams, as frustrating as they might be, they really are that kind of call for you to look deeper into what is frustrating you right now. Like, where do you need to grab something maybe by the horns and just face it? Because when we get into stress dreams, we're starting to dance a bit in shadow. And when we're dealing with that, we're dealing with parts of ourselves that we don't truly own yet, that we don't identify with. And there can be some really positive dynamics pulled from a stress dream that speak to sort of potential next steps for your own growth.
Right. So the idea that stress dreams are or can be interactions with shadow material, I think is true. And that was the next point I was going to make, is that a stress dream is indicative of the psyche engaging in some kind of struggle or some kind of tension.
Yeah.
And maybe, again, because it's projective, it could be that the psyche is being hypervigilant against something. Maybe there's like a very literal, obvious stress in your life. For instance, like you have a bunch of kids and they're stressing you out. But there could be sort of more subtle, kind of hidden struggle or stress going on in your life. Like, for instance, maybe someone that you really trust made a comment about your character, and that comment is actually touching upon some really shadowy things that are going on in your life. For instance, like, you know, maybe they made a comment that you don't actually take good care of your friends or something like that. That'd be a pretty on the nose comment, but that might touch upon like some really deep insecurities. And even if you kind of brush off the comment as like, oh, that didn't mean anything to me, it might actually be touching upon something that is like threatening to the ego that thinks, no, I'm a good person. I take care of everyone. I love everyone. I'm so self-sacrificial, and so I'm just so quick to like help everyone I know. Like, you know, you might just like believe that you're a good person, but deep down you actually have this like underlying fear that you're not actually a good person at all. And so if you're confronted with some sort of evidence, for example, that you are actually in fact a bad person, whatever that might be, the ego might be sort of like under attack.
Yeah.
The story of self might be under attack. The story that I'm a good person might be under attack by some little truth bomb. And so a stress dream could represent the psyche trying to process that. Maybe it's trying to keep something suppressed, and that's manifesting in the form of stress for the psyche. Or maybe it's actually engaging in a positive, productive way, where it's integrating some sort of threat. And by integrating it, kind of actually processes the threat and reestablishes some sort of harmony. So a stress dream in itself could actually be evidence of something productive that's happening inside of you.
Like metabolizing.
Right.
Yeah, it reminds me of a post that I did on Substack a little while ago. It's called Gazing in a Reflective Shield, and it's about these explorations of my own inner work around dynamics of the feminine and some of my own history. And I talk about a dream in the restaurant where I'm taking an order, and suddenly these two female managers in the middle of the floor on a busy shift start fighting. And I'm horrified as it's happening. And they're screaming at each other. And I'm really freaked out. I like pull the women off the floor and I go to like the general manager and I'm like, you need to do something about this. And then the general manager is like really like apathetic and just kind of like doesn't really respond. And when I woke from that dream, there was so much stress to it that I could feel. And as I kind of dug deeper into it, I started looking at each of those sort of like projective containers, each of those figures, managers who should be responsible, taking care of things, are entangled, right? Like there's some parts of myself that are fighting each other. And there's sort of an attempt by the dream ego, the I and the dream, to try to address it, but I don't feel like I have the resources. Something I feel I should rely upon, like the highest manager, the general, isn't helping out. And in some ways, as I've reflected on it and read the post for more insight, you know, I think in part I'm seeing a struggle that's happening presently, like being reflected in my dream. I think I'm seeing parts of myself trying to address it and like metabolize some of that darkness. Like part of me has a volition to even address it, right? I don't just run away. And yet I still feel at a loss for how to handle it. So you're seeing all of these varying viewpoints in the stress stream, from how maybe the most conscious ego point of view is handling it to the inner parts that are kind of like in a power struggle. And some of it, I think, speaks to addressing and integration, and other parts speak to like a lot of work that still needs to be done in this area.
Stress dream could also be, you might say, a commentary on something that's lacking in your life.
Yeah,
It might not
totally.
be as obvious as like, well, clearly my job is stressful. Clearly my kids are stressful. It might not be that like the psyche is like under threat from some sort of realization that it doesn't want to come to. There could also be the notion that your body, the unconscious, you might say, knows that you need something. It's saying like, this is lacking in your life. Your life is out of balance.
Yeah.
There's a void where this thing should be.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a romantic partner. Maybe it's like a new romantic partner. Maybe it's a different kind of friendship or community. Maybe it's a different kind of job. Maybe it's living somewhere that's more fulfilling or more in touch with your values, etc. But if, for instance, your job was deeply unsatisfying, but in the waking world, you didn't actually feel conscious of that. You weren't registering that for whatever reason. Maybe your narrative is like, well, I have a responsibility to make this money right now, to raise my family, or maybe I have a responsibility to keep this job right now because this is a prestigious job that looks good. There's all kinds of stories you may be telling yourself to sort of maintain like the coherent narrative that like, I'm in the right place, I'm on the right track, while under the surface in the unconscious, there's actually something deeply lacking. Maybe your job actually doesn't feel very meaningful at all. Maybe it's not very fulfilling. Maybe you feel like you're just totally crushing your soul when you go to work, but you don't realize that you're not in touch with that. And so a stress dream where, perhaps there's some sort of conflict going on in the dream, or maybe you can't find something that you need, for instance. I don't think I'm doing some self-interpretation here, but maybe if you're having dreams where you can't find the toilet, maybe the dream is that like you're actually searching for some way to unload some kind of shadowy burden, and you're searching and searching, and you can't find it, and you can't find it.
Yeah.
Maybe the unconscious is saying like, unburden me, unburden me. There's something here that you need to process.
It's like poop dreams too.
Poop dreams.
Poop dreams.
Don't have many of those, honestly. But
poop dreams in the sense of like there's pipes that are going to burst, or like a toilet that's overflowing.
Yeah.
When you get into this, like the excrement, these like very typical symbols for shadow material, and it's not being addressed, and you start seeing these dreams coming forward where it's like something needs to be let go of, or something needs to be addressed, or it's going to burst at the seams, or something's been built up over time. That's where you start to see, at least in a more stereotypical common way, that kind of compensatory image where something that is not being addressed and that needs to be brought forth is coming through the dream in this kind of strange, nonsensical way. But if you allow yourself to kind of put on your symbolic glasses and view it through this lens of the image speaking to something really deep inside of you that needs to be processed, which I think is why like poop and pee dreams are so common, because it's like this very natural biological process that all of us have that keeps the system healthy. So it's a really interesting dream symbol to come forward for like psychological cleansing that needs to happen. And when you're not doing it, you might start to see that image come forward in the dream.
So another example, let's say you have a stress dream where your teeth are falling out, and
Yep.
You might not be clear like what is that about exactly, and let's say you interpret this sort of typically, which is that the mouth is representative of our ability to engage with the world and change the world, because the mouth is sort of like the word. It's the logos. It's language, which is sort of like a primary way in which consciousness actually interacts with its reality is through language. So let's say that's what's happening. You have a stress dream. Your teeth are falling out. It could be that some part of you that's repressed, some part of you that's not actually in ego consciousness. There's no awareness there. Some part of you is actually afraid that it's losing its ability to engage in the world, or it's losing its voice.
Yeah.
Like some part of you, maybe that's working too hard in the office, is afraid that it's losing its ability to engage creatively in the world.
Yeah.
And so there's a lack there. you're having a stress dream about your teeth falling out because you're actually not engaging creatively enough in your own passion. You're not exploring your need to you're not exploring your need to explore is what I was about to say. But for instance, if you've let go of some passion of yours, maybe it was music or painting, or maybe it was just getting out and hiking or going to shows, whatever. And a dream about your teeth falling out could be pointing towards something that is calling you. And that's like not very intuitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you are having stress dreams, it's important to kind of try to examine what the dream is maybe playing upon. And like it might be hypervigilance of the psyche, essentially saying like, you're in a really stressful situation. So like I'm like automatically mentally preparing for tomorrow, which is going to be stressful. Like that could be one thing, like more kind of like literal interpretation of like my life is stressful. That's why I had a stress dream. But it could also be something that like you're lacking, something that you need to go find or explore that you're not in touch with. Maybe your romantic relationship actually isn't really satisfying your needs and you're not actually in touch with that. And you need to examine that. And that's why you're having stress dreams. Or it could be, like we said, like that your story, your narrative of self, your ego, however you want to phrase it, is like under attack. Aspect of your psyche is like under attack from possibly a different aspect of your psyche, which is trying to resolve some kind of tension.
Yeah.
And so the best way to approach these things is to kind of, again, try to develop an inner ontology, essentially, or kind of a catalog of what symbols must mean about your life, what certain people in the dreams must mean about your life, what certain environments, like for instance, like the classroom in the dream, like what could that possibly be referring to in a more kind of phenomenological, mythological way in your life. And overall, the stress dreams are just sort of representations of tension.
Yeah.
In the most broad sense, I guess you could say.
You're touching on some points from the original dream episodes, is why it is so important to build out your own symbol dictionary, you might say. Like keep your own journal of what images come up and how you relate to them. And of course, keep yourself open to common meanings of images, the archetypal meanings, how these things arise mythologically, how you see them in pop culture. All of that has a place, but ultimately the dream reveals itself through the dreamer. And so when I have a teeth dream, there's something that's being communicated, and I'm likely to find personal associations to that by one, tracking it, and two, exploring what it means to me. And it will be more powerful rather than just trying to find a generalized meaning, especially with teeth dreams, by the way. Like these seem to like kind of really scour the landscape of potential meaning. It's quite interesting. But you will see that your dreams are often communicating something rather, how do I say this? It's very refined sometimes, the dream symbol, to a degree that image occurs again and occurs again and again it comes up. So there's something very almost intelligent in a way, the way that the psyche works, that it draws upon this kind of like repository of your own associations. So by figuring out what it means to you, you will gain greater access to the literacy of what's being communicated to you each night in the dreams.
So let's move on to nightmares. I wouldn't say that nightmares are qualitatively different from stress dreams. I think they're playing essentially on the same machinery.
Yeah.
They might just be more extreme
And like
in some
amped
sense.
up.
They could be pumped up. It might also be the case that they're actually sort of different in quality, that maybe a nightmare really is a different process than a stress dream. It's hard to say, obviously, and it's important to keep an open mind either way about what do these things actually represent, because there is sort of the universal sense of what they represent to everyone. Like everyone has nightmares, and therefore nightmares represent this to everyone. There is that aspect, but there's also like personal things. Like what nightmares are to you as an individual might not fulfill the same role they do for someone else. It's important to keep that in mind. But all this stuff we've said so far about stress dreams, I think they still apply to nightmares.
Yeah, I
Like
agree.
the dynamics are still the same. The processes are still mostly the same. But it does feel like nightmares are different.
Mm,
Not being able to find a toilet is stressful, but it's certainly not horrifying.
yeah.
Whereas, common nightmares, being murdered or, things like drowning or coming into contact with some monster.
A deep fear for your life, I think, is
Yeah.
often very common.
Yeah, kind of like the feeling like I'm going to die,
Mm.
like something is about to kill me or I'm going to die, obviously is like kind of the most sort of extreme kind of situation you could really be in, I guess, in life, is just sort of this feeling that like death is like imminent in this moment. And so I'm trying to think of like a personal example of I don't really have nightmares very often. Like it's very, very rare and always has been rare, even as a child, for me to have nightmares. But when I do, and it's the kind of thing that like sort of shakes me awake, and I'm like, oh God, like what the fuck was that? It's usually has to do with some sort of like monster figure,
Hmm.
which is interesting. I don't really have the feeling of like, oh, I'm being chased by someone with a knife, they're going to stab me to death. That's not really a thing that happens with me very often, but I do have the experience of a dream getting kind of strange, maybe kind of stressful, and like there's like someone in the dream I'm interacting with, and like the person I'm interacting with starts struggling with me, and then they're slowly just kind of morphing into like this monster figure with like huge teeth, and
Okay.
who's essentially just going to like devour me, and then like I wake up. Like stuff like that is like kind of what happens. Or there's some sort of weird like lizardy like gremlin thing that just sort of appears in my dream and just sort of like starts attacking me. But that's like what's most common for me for nightmares that actually wake me up. And when I wake up, there's kind of this feeling of like, oh God, I need to like get up out of bed and like kind of like wake up a bit. Because if I fall back asleep, I'm sort of afraid I'm just going to fall right back into the same nightmare.
Yeah.
So that doesn't happen very often for me. That's like maybe like once every 6 months I have something like that.
Oh, it's pretty often, I think.
You think so? Once every 6 months?
Well, I think as I really don't have nightmares, but I have a lot of stress dreams. So I
Okay.
feel like a lot of my inner stuff is just like bubbling up in like constantly in all these like smaller ways, you might say, rather than having these like big, powerful, intense nightmares. Like for me, when I was trying to think about my own experience, I just could only think back to childhood where I had a fairly occurring nightmare of being chased by a vampire figure in like my backyard of where I used to live. And that went on, I think, for like a couple of years. And when I think about it, it's like, what was it that was nightmarish? Wasn't just that there was this really scary figure, but that when I woke up from it, I had this intense emotional response. And especially being a child, obviously, it wasn't even just fear, like that itself was really scary, but it's just throughout the whole system, high alert, feeling of being extremely on edge, a lot of fear. And so I think that's what's really notable about nightmares, like that they elicit that extremely strong response, that there are intense images coming up in the dream, but then there is also a somatic element as well, that you'll feel it in a really deeply embodied way of like kind of shaking with it as you wake up. And nightmares for me, then when I think about it through that lens, it's like I don't think I'm really experiencing that kind of intensity. But I would say that I think pretty much every few weeks I'm having like a couple stress dreams.
That's pretty often.
I know. I'm stressed out.
You're stressed out. So what's happening with a nightmare? If a stress dream is the psyche engaging with some kind of tension or inner struggle or trying to defend itself from unwanted information, you might say, is a nightmare just sort of the psyche like losing that battle or
It's
something?
interesting.
Like there's a struggle going on, the psyche just like it just loses, or the psyche can't hold the tension. right? So if you're going to, for instance, if any sort of form of integration, if you're going to integrate your shadow, for instance, tension needs to be held. It has to be like a slow, gradual process, like titration, like one drop at a time of shadow. Because too much shadow at once, and you're going to have the opposite effect. You're going to be repelled. You're gonna purge. You're going to become even more traumatized than you already were. Let's say. So if a stress dream is holding that tension and kind of like integrating some shadow in that sense, maybe a nightmare is that the psyche just like cannot hold the tension, and it just sort of severs the link to the shadow thing in some violent way. So instead of like the tug of war of integration, of like integrate, there might just be like, get the fuck away from me. Like it's, which is often what people do when they're confronted with their shadow.
Yeah. Or I don't even know if the dream itself would be showing the like, get the fuck away from me part, or so much as it's maybe imaging the total intense reality of facing that thing that you've been in the tug of war with. And here is it in its complete essence and power and overwhelming nature. Because in some ways, I think about how that nightmare material is that more condensed, more pure version of, say, that shadow aspect that you're facing in a very real, very visceral way in the nightmare. And how overwhelming it is, how intense it is being reflected in the imagery that's being chosen. So that, like, it's interesting to me when you brought up your nightmare dream that you're kind of engaging with something that seems maybe almost kind of normal, relatable at first. It's like a figure, it's a person, and it continues to evolve. So your tug of war, which was in some ways like the tension was being held, suddenly one side of it just like goes Super Saiyan or something, right? Like it just like blows up in power, and it becomes this awesome, intense beast that you cannot fight. And I think sometimes that's what happens with unconscious material. That's what happens with shadow. That's what happens with parts of us that we've dissociated from. When we see them in its fullness or something close to its fullness, it's a monster. It's insane. You can't even process it. It's so overwhelming, and it takes over. And then what that releases in the body also comes through in the dream, and obviously as you wake up too.
Right. So inner demons, right? It's one common way of phrasing this sort of thing we're talking about is a demon is, something scary and horrible that's from the depths of hell.
Yeah.
And we're fighting our inner demons in the sense that like there are things within us that we just don't want to confront because they're too scary.
Yeah.
And they're too threatening to this self-mythology, this sort of narrative that I have going. Or, it's a traumatic event from the past that was just it was so much chaos at once. It was so much danger at once that you couldn't possibly face it. So you suppressed it instead. And if that's brought up back to the surface, the response is not just like, oh, that's interesting. Like the response is like, get it away from me, get it as far away from me as possible.
Yeah.
So that's why nightmares are often involving some sort of what you might call essentially a demonic figure. Maybe it's a monster, maybe it's some sort of murderer, serial killer, or maybe it's something a little more strange than that, like a fiery wall coming towards you or something like that. But the demon is not something, for instance, if there's like little sort of semi-shadowy things that like you can actually kind of hold tension with, like, one person pulls you aside at a party and says like, like you kind of have a tendency to like talk too much. Sometimes when you're talking to people, like you kind of just talk too much, and like they kind of feel like you're not listening to them. They sort of like want to get out of the conversation. Like, do you realize you're doing that? Like that's like that could be someone like something that you could handle. Like, oh really? Okay, like, and that's like that shadow. It's out of awareness, and that might make you feel kind of like bad about yourself.
Yeah.
But you can still handle it. Like one person just says that, and you're like, oh, okay, I can handle that. Like it's a little tiny thing. It's not like even a demon. It's just sort of this little dark thing that,
It's like a little gremlin guy.
yeah, little like friendly gremlin, like a furry one, like before it's midnight and it's turned into like the evil demonic one. And you can kind of be like, oh, I can integrate that. Like, that's a good point. Good to know. I will try to be more mindful of listening to other people instead of talking so much. But if you can imagine, like, everyone at the party sat you down and we're like, we're having an intervention here. And like, you talk too much. And also everything you have to say is stupid. And like, I agree with it. And I agree with it. And we all agree with it. And it's just like, everyone's just like, shame on you. Shame. You know, like that could be like a kind of confrontation with shadowy stuff in you that is so overwhelming that your response is not like, oh, okay, thanks for letting me know. It's just like, I'm never coming here ever again. I'm never talking to any of these people ever again. And I don't even know if I want friends anymore because that was so painful and difficult, you know? So it's like being confronted with something that is so overwhelmingly threatening and so overwhelmingly like cataclysmic to your story of self. That's the kind of response. It's just sort of like, purge it, get it away. Don't want to look at it, cannot deal with it, like I'm done. And so in the dreams, that's the equivalent of like a demon, like inner demon, right? Is like the nightmare is for some reason engaging with that thing.
Yeah.
And the response is like, wake up or freak the fuck out or whatever it might happen when you're having a nightmare. And it can be kind of traumatic.
For sure.
So it's I think an interesting question to ask about nightmares is essentially like, are they productive, right? Is what's happening actually like intended by the body? Is like, this will be a useful thing for me to do is to confront this shadowy thing. Or is it almost like a mistake? Like, which is what I kind of wonder is like, is sort of the dream ego, let's say, sort of just like tiptoeing around the unconscious and exploring, and it like opens the wrong door. And it's just like, there's a demon there. And it's like, whoa, fuck. Like, I didn't mean to do that. Right.
Yeah.
Because that can happen in life is like you wander around and you can accidentally stumble upon something that's really shadowy and threatening and be like, well, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to go there. And I'm wondering, you know, is that true about dreams as well? It's like nightmares can just be sort of like psychic mistakes. Like, whoops, didn't mean to go into the depths of hell right there. Like, I just fell in.
That's a very interesting idea. Yeah. And I want to be like, yes, because of course there's just so many realms of possibility. But as you're saying that, more of like what's coming up for me is how we might engage in certain activities that open the floodgates of the unconscious. I don't know why I'm talking like that. Trying to be very tiptoeing around this idea that sometimes we don't know what we're doing. Like we take some drugs. It will be fun. Just have a good time.
Yeah.
Whoops, that seems to dissolve the veil between ego and unconscious. And suddenly you're having like a really bad trip. For some people, that even turns into like psychotic episodes. It's like really freaky shit that can happen. Even doing therapeutic work, doing some imaginal work. If you've got trauma, even doing yoga and actually feeling your body for the first time, it's like, whoops, I opened the wrong door. I didn't know it was there. We're so dissociated from these parts of ourselves, whether that's somewhere in the body or somewhere in the imaginal realm, that we might accidentally open that door. And what we see is completely overwhelming. So can it happen in dreams? It's like, yeah, I think that's possible. But something else I want to bring in that I think is just like a really fascinating area of development in the Jungian space is the work of Donald Kalshed, who's a Jungian analyst. And he focuses a lot on trauma, and through his clinical work started to see these really interesting patterns for individuals who had a lot of either early developmental trauma or bigger traumas a little bit later in life. And that what essentially happens is like our psychological defense system is constellated. It's brought forward. And the job of that system is to protect the person from being re-traumatized. And it does so in a way that is both protective, but also persecutory. And he especially noticed that in the dreams of individuals who had quite intense trauma, and then were trying to address it in analysis, that these images, these nightmarish figures would come forward in dreams, especially as they started to do work and make a meaningful move forward. something like not a nightmare would come forward where there's like a murderer who's trying to like shoot the person with a shotgun. This is like, I should have written down the actual dream itself, but in one of his books, he talks about this. And this woman is trying to reconnect with these parts. And I think in the dream, she sees like a little girl, and then this figure comes in and just like shoots it with a shotgun. It's like totally insane. But the idea here is that this really intense, almost violent, persecutory figure is trying to prevent what is wounded inside from coming out or from healing. Even it's trying to prevent, because its job really is to stop you from ever getting close to that thing that was too overwhelming at some point. So that inner protector is trying to really hold back that original unbearable experience. And the more that you do the inner work, the more it tries to protect you, and it will do so in like violent ways. And I think we even see that in the behavior of some people who are trying to maybe address certain things. And it's so scary, it's so overwhelming that they just kind of self-sabotage, or they really struggle to get past certain kind of thresholds. And that has to be taken into consideration, that like nightmares may inadvertently be these representations of parts of ourselves that will at any cost try to prevent us from touching something inside of ourselves that is so deeply wounded.
So the idea that you're putting forward is like the demon that appears in your dream is actually trying to keep you out of a certain area of the psyche. So like your dream might be like, you might be moving along and you're like going to enter a chamber, and the chamber is actually something that's like very, very traumatic.
Yeah. And it's like, it's anticipating probably that you're getting too close. And in that way, it's kind of like prospective style of dreaming, where it's kind of, the psyche seems to be tracking where you're going. And even though you're not there yet, it's like, do not go any further.
Okay. Interesting spin on what I was previously saying is that, so the demon is essentially like, get out.
Yeah.
Like,
get out.
You
think
can't come
this
here.
is bad. Right. You're not like, you're just in the first circle.
Yeah. That's interesting.
That is.
It's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
As the figures, like the beast in my dreams, for instance, like the thing that like he turns into the monster, the thing that I'm trying to sort of like tangle with, like, I'm holding tension with some shadow energy, and it's like evolving into like some sort of beast to say like, get away from here, like turn back.
Yeah, don't
like,
go any further.
Don't go in here.
Yeah.
And the dream ego is like, oh, okay, like I'll get away, like, so.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. Definitely recommend. He has 2 books that you can read if you're interested, but it just goes to show you that there's so much nuance around dreams and around trauma, especially, and around these aspects of shadow that for some people, I think those types of manifestations are true. And his clinical examples are really, really fascinating. And it speaks to, really, if we were to kind of tie back to our last episode, how important that principle of titration is when we're working with shadowy, dark, traumatic, wounded aspects of ourselves. There's only so much that the system can take. It was cut off for a reason. You've got to learn to integrate that in manageable, digestible ways. You can't overwhelm yourself. And so the nightmare in some ways might be slowing that process down. And in some cases, like totally trying to put a stop to it. But I think you can work with it if you're mindful enough and if you've got the right support.
So let's get into that real quick to close out the episode. What are some ways to work with the kind of material that comes forward in stress dreams and in nightmares?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, building that awareness around what's coming up in dreams through tracking them, knowing what the patterns are, what is the recurring imagery, what are the themes, finding that connection and making meaningful, like dynamic connections to what it is. So it isn't just like, oh, another stress dream. Like you've got to do some of that legwork, and that can be a little frustrating in the beginning because you'll never really know if you're right. You're not going to know for sure that your interpretation is correct. No one's like, okay, thumbs up, that's right. But the more that you keep at it, the more that you notice those things continuing, the more refined your understanding will get. So that as you do that, you can start to work with it in more dynamic ways. Like you notice that certain image or you notice that certain type of dream. now you can start to work with it in your journaling. You know, why don't you sit down with the dream and work through it piece by piece? Why don't you rewrite the dream? Why don't you do like an active imagination if that doesn't feel too scary or overwhelming with a certain image? You have to really understand all the dynamics and lay down that foundation to meaningfully get into what's trying to be represented.
So all the things we've talked about on the podcast, as far as ways in which you can work with dreams, they apply here. A dream journal is a good thing to keep. That could take a lot of different forms, but just writing down your dreams, developing a catalog of imagery, like what's the recurring imagery in your dreams? What do they mean? Just for example, knives are in my dreams a lot. I've talked about this before many times, but like knives are something that appears so often in my dream that I've actually developed a kind of like understanding of like, what is this really referring to? I think knives are referring in my dream to power, or to the thinking function, or to the way in which I problem solve in my reality. That's what knives are. So you can kind of develop that sort of fluency in your individual dream imagery. And of course you can also sort of pay attention and do some research on like what universal imagery is out there. And that can be sort of tricky because, again, like just because you saw a snake, it doesn't mean that you are seeing whatever is being represented, like in the Bible, for instance. Like it's important to not make too strong a connection to universal, quote unquote, dream imagery or stereotypical dream imagery, but still important to kind of develop that sort of fluency. And the active imagination stuff, an important point to make here, I think, is that you don't need to come to a really rational, intellectual understanding of your dreams and what they mean, and that it might be enough. It might be healthy and productive enough to just process the dream, even if you aren't coming to a conscious understanding of exactly what it means.
Yeah.
So if you just write down your dream and what happened in it, and you never return to it again, you never think about it again, even just the act of putting the pen to the paper and going through the dream, externalizing it, it actually like does something. It might process it, it might metabolize it in some way. And if you're doing active imagination, for instance, if you're going to take the dream imagery and you're going to walk back through it in a more conscious waking state, like you're essentially dreaming while you're awake, just the act of dreaming while you're awake could actually be productive. You could actually sort of process, metabolize, resolve some of that energy that is being brought up in the dream. And you don't necessarily need to do the active imagination to be like, aha, like the flying bowling ball clearly represents my marriage. Like you don't have to come to that conclusion.
Sure. Yeah.
And if you do come to those conclusions, like pay attention, divination for sure. It's like if something means something to you, then it means something to you and don't question it.
Yeah.
But you don't need to come to a hyper intellectual understanding of what everything means.
Yeah. It's just like being with it, right?
Just being with it, just experiencing it. A lot of changes, the vast majority of changes that are happening to you are happening unconsciously.
Yeah.
And so just processing things the same way that you might, go for a jog. It's like going for a jog is affecting you. It's changing your body. It's metabolizing things. It's even good for your brain, but like, it's not like going for a jog is like intellectually, like, I understand now that like the way that my legs move equally, it's like there's things happening unconsciously that are healthy and you don't need to come to a complete understanding of those things.
Yeah. I think in that same vein, how can you artistically work with the dream images? Even if it's just like, I want to draw that really scary dude who's in my dreams, and that act of externalization that's not through words this time, but rather through art and image, or, maybe you like to sculpt, or maybe you like to play music. There's ways to hold that psychic material in a waking state that just gives it a little bit of space. And even sometimes like the color choice speaks to something that needs to be expressed, or, what key you want to write your song in about your monster nightmare, it says something.
Metal music.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So explore what that might mean. right? You don't have to go through this like deeply analytical process of like figuring out every aspect of the dream and it means this and I come to this conclusion. But, what does it bring forth within you that needs to be held and tended to? And I think another viewpoint to consider is what is like a resource that can be cultivated as these stress dreams or nightmares come up, like a helper or a helpful attitude or this like helpful strategy that connects you to the dream and waking reality, but it's like sort of in balance in an oppositional way to it, right? So if there's a lot of fear in a dream around these certain images, what comes up for you that represents like hope or joy or connection? And I think that there could be a lot of really interesting work to not necessarily sit in the dark and difficult, but rather to sit in a resource and have an active imagination with the resource. Because sometimes trying to work with a harsher, darker material is actually really overwhelming. And for some people, you just cannot go there, especially alone. So you don't have to. Like for some people, sure, like have fun, do that if you feel called to it. But for others, consider what might make you feel strengthened, supported, so that even on a more unconscious level, the next time that you enter into the dream space, there might be a shift that has happened. Maybe things are a little less scary. Maybe something about that resource actually comes through in the dream itself. So there are ways really to cultivate other aspects that strengthen and support you.
So one last thought before we end the episode. As we've already been alluding to, but just to make it more explicit, it's important to interpret stress dreams and nightmares as not necessarily being bad things.
Mm-hmm.
If you are experiencing a lot of stress dreams, if you're having nightmares, it could be easy to sort of think like, what's wrong with me? Like, I shouldn't be having stress dreams. I shouldn't be having nightmares. Like, something is obviously very wrong with me if this is happening. And that's not always the case. And that a lot of our efforts to sort of pretend that we are healthy and that nothing is wrong and that we are fully functional and like smiling all the time, like shiny, happy people are just like, everyone's so happy and great. That's actually counterproductive because all of us have a lot of darkness under the surface. All of us have a huge amount of shadow that we have to deal with. And so, as we're saying, because stress dreams and nightmares could possibly be interpreted as processing that shadow or engaging with it or integrating it, you should not be aiming to stop having these dreams altogether or wake up and say, oh God, like I don't want this to be happening to me. It's important to kind of understand that this is all a process and that to engage with our own darkness is really the only way that we move towards healing and move towards becoming whole. If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up to date with my musings and writing, subscribe to the Golden Shadow Journal at goldenshadow.substack.com.
If you're interested in working with myself or Alyssa, go to our websites, alyssapolizzi.com and arranrogerson.com.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.